like an exercise circle with preschool children that could have some health benefits, and then it could accidentally have some social skill benefits as well. And that's quite interesting, but that's not what we're looking at in this study. We're looking at tools built specifically to teach social and emotional skills. And for the C, comparison or control, we looked at high quality design, so experimental or quasi-experimental. And that means that when you do an intervention, you do them for some preschools, and then you have preschools to compare with that didn't get the intervention. So we want to make sure there's a contrast, a kind of difference that we can observe between these groups. And then for the O, the outcome, we had just a broad search of any relevant outcome. So it could be social emotional skills, or it could be problem behavior, some sort of impact that these interventions have quantitatively. So we did a broad search first, ended up with about 5,000 studies or publications. We painstakingly reviewed and screened all of these, looking at titles and abstracts, and ended up with about 105, which is about 2% of these studies were considered a bit relevant. And then we had a lot of work looking at these 100 studies to make sure, these studies that seem relevant, are they really relevant when we're looking more deeply at them? And it turns out most of them were not relevant. We only ended up with 2 systematic reviews in the end. So from 5,000 publications down to 2. And these are the 2. A study by Blewett and colleagues in 2018, and a study published in 2020 by Luo and colleagues. And they have a bit different wording here, but they're basically kind of looking at the same thing as we are interested in looking at. So what are the effects of social emotional learning preschool interventions, basically? And they had a few differences in how they did the same thing as we did. They screened a lot of studies, Blewett about 13,000, Luo for some reason screened 30,000 studies, so they had some difference in how they were searching. Ended up with about the same number of studies that they looked at more deeply. And then when they start to include studies in their systematic reviews, they were a bit different. So Blewett had almost 80 studies, and Luo only about 40. So for some reason, Luo ended up with only half the studies that Blewett and colleagues had. Some of these are because of age. Blewett had a bit more extended search radius for the age range. So they had like 2 to 6 year olds included. Luo only had 3 to 5 year olds included. But there's still some studies that we're not sure why they didn't include, or vice versa. So there's a lot of overlap, but some of the non-overlap is unaccounted for, and there should be a lot of overlap because these are very similar studies. So we're not sure what that is about. And basically, what they did is a so-called meta-analysis. So you can do a systematic review, and a lot of systematic reviews also add a meta-analysis, and that when you take, you summarize the quantities of the outcomes into a single measure. So they had a different approach, a bit different approaches to these. Blewett calculated Cohen's D, and Luo calculated Hedges D, and just don't worry about that, they're very similar, so you don't have to remember what I just said. And the point of these is that they're all in the positive direction, they're all in the expected direction. All of the outcomes said social and emotional interventions give the benefits that we're expecting. So that's all this is saying. The problem is that we judge this as having a high risk of bias. We promote a more cautionary or tentative interpretation of these results. So while it's exciting, we're not as excited as they are. And the reason for that is something that has been lifted a bit earlier today, and that's that SEL, social emotional learning, is a very broad concept. We have a lot of different, we use the same words, but we don't always mean the same thing, basically. And that could be good in some situations. In this situation, when you're summarizing things, especially quantitatively, it may produce unreliable results. So basically what they're doing, they're summarizing many different interventions into one effect size. That could be a problem because you have social emotional interventions that are very integrated, like you learn a practice, a skill as a teacher, for instance, specific behavioral feedback or praise, like, oh, thank you so much, children, for cleaning up very nicely, look how clean this is. So that could be one way of increasing skills. It could be an intervention that is more lesson-based, that you're having specific, let's have a lesson about friendship skills or something like that, and then you will be directly teaching the students or the children something about friendship skills, and maybe have even a manualized lesson package, like paths or positive action or second step or some kind of manualized intervention like that. And then you also might have some kind of mindfulness intervention or mindfulness exercises and things like that. So mixing all these, when you do meta-analysis or systematic reviews, you usually want some kind of, you're comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, and this becomes more of a fruit salad, and you're not really, and it's difficult to taste the individual parts of things. They're hard to recognize the individual parts when it's very mixed like that. And that also becomes increasingly difficult when it's different kinds of study design that have different risks of bias. They use very different outcomes. Some are looking at Luo and Blewett. They had these few outcomes, but in these specific outcomes, like problems behavior, for instance, there can be a very different way of measuring them. And that's also very difficult if you are doing that kind of synthesis, that you don't mix these methods of assessment too much, because some measurements are kind of easy to see change in, some assessments are quite difficult to see change in, so there can be a lot of risks in doing that. I think when there are more medical meta-analysis, they have like maybe a specific substance, like paracetamol or something. And then when they have outcomes, they have maybe a specific biomarker, like systolic blood pressure or something. And maybe very similar design, like all of them are double-blind studies. So that becomes more of an apple-to-apple comparison. With these kind of mixed bags, it's less useful. Practitioners, policymakers will still may have to go back and look at the individual studies, the primary studies, instead of relying on these systematic reviews that are made to make things easier for us. So we think the results of these systematic reviews should be interpreted with caution. It's hard to say that all cell interventions in preschools provide good results or positive outcomes. You're probably better off looking at the specific programs or studies or things like that. So that's unfortunate, because you want something substantial to say with your systematic review. And it's also important that the primary studies in themselves are of high quality. We saw many flaws in the primary studies as well, and that also increases the uncertainty when you're summarizing these things. So recommendations for future systematic reviews might be that you look at more specific things within social and emotional learning. So maybe you have a specific systematic reviews that look specifically at mindfulness exercises and their outcomes, specifically at lesson-based intervention and their outcomes, or something like that. So it's important that we're very precise in what we're talking about, and not always using social and emotional learning as a very general umbrella, because as you've seen, there are a lot of different ways of conceptualizing social emotional learning, and in some situations we need to be quite precise in what we're talking about, what we're studying, what we mean, to make things useful when we're doing studies like these for policymakers, practitioners, and other researchers. So yeah, 15 minutes, Nadia. That's it for me.
It's exactly 15 minutes. Questions?
Yes, wait for the question. Can I have a picture of you with this nice... Stay there. In middle.
In the middle.
Smile.
Имаме няколко минути за въпроси. Ако някой има въпрос, имаме микрофони. Имате ли въпроси към Дариуш? Както той каза, статията е на свободен достъп, налична е онлайн. Има също линк в платформата и в сайта на проекта. Имало е въпроси относно книжки и така нататък. Абсолютно всичко е качено онлайн, на свободен достъп. Нямаме въпроси. Извинявам се. Може ли? Да. Добре. It's open.
Искам да попитам дали има изследвания, които определят каква част от ежедневието на децата би трябвало да бъде заета от тези специфични програми, които вие казахте. И знаем, че децата на тая възраст трябва да спят 12 часа. Остават останалите 12. Доколкото на мен ми е известно, чуждоезиковото обучение също казва, че е много важно до 5 годишна възраст да има такава част в детските градини тук в България. Същото се отнася за музиката. Има ли изследвания, които казват еди каква си пропорция от дневния режим на децата би трябвало да бъде фокусирана, специално насочена към социално-емоционалните, изграждане на социално-емоционални компетенции?
Yeah, so the main question, as I understood it by Nadia's translation, is how much children or students should be exposed to social and emotional programming, basically. And I think there are different answers depending on the intervention, and I think there's a lot to be studied. And that's also one of the things that should be very important for primary studies to specify the dosage and what the response is based on this. But we can see that there's a few lesson packages, for instance, that have effects in preschools, and they are like based on maybe two or three times, about 20 to 30 minutes a day, or it could be 4 to 5 times a week, 15 or 20 minutes a day, if the package itself is a good package that has been quite rigorously developed and tested. But that's for lesson-based, so there are also more integrated practices, and that's kind of hard to answer right now. But I think this is an area where we need to be more specific and study more rigorously, so we have better answers to that kind of question. But right now, as we saw in these systematic reviews, they tried to look at things like dosage and things like that, but there was not enough data. Too few studies looked at these parameters. And that's made them hard to analyze in the end. But it's an important question.
Maybe if I can add, what is really important when we're talking about skills is not just the dosage, the activities, but also that it needs continuous intervention. It's not just one activity this week and then another activity in a month or another one in 2 months. It needs really programming and following, would it be lesson, package of activities, so yeah, but it really needs continuous intervention.